Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayamudire Nashtiprayeshu Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtike. So continuing with the discussion on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 11, Chapter 3, text number 5 onwards. So Antariksh ji Yogendra, he is speaking now. And the question was, what is Maya? What is illusory energy of the Lord? Gunar Gunans Bhunjana Atma Pratyotipah Prabhu Manyaman Idam Srishtam Atmanam E Sajjate. The individual living being, the master of the material body, uses his material senses, which have been activated by the supersoul, to try to enjoy sense objects composed of the three modes of nature. Thus, he misidentifies the created material body with the unborn eternal self and becomes entangled in the illusory energy of the Lord. So although we are master of the material body, but we use our material senses which are activated by Supersoul, because he is a Rishikesh, he is a controller of all the senses. But what we do to use senses to try to enjoy the sense objects, which are composed of three modes of nature. Material, they're all material. But we forget, because then it said, thus he misidentifies a created material body with the unborn eternal self, which is a soul, Jivatma. And then slowly he becomes more and more entangled. In this verse, the living entity is called Prabhu or Master, because he is a minute part and parcel of the Supreme Master Krishna. Similarly, in Bhagavad Gita, the Lord has described the living entity as Ishvara, the controller. The living entity in the material world carries his various conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aromas. Srila Prabhupada has commented in his purport. Here, the living entity is described as Ishvara, the controller of his own body. If he likes, he can change his body to a higher grade, and if he likes, he can move to a lower class. Minute independence, very minute independence. It means just a desire. The change his body undergoes depends upon him. This statement confirms the words Swamatra and Atma Prasiddha in the text 3 of this chapter. If the Supreme Lord were to interfere with the minute independence of the living entity, there would be no question of the living entities engaging in the loving service of the Lord, since love implies a spontaneous free choice by the lover. So the point is sometimes people ask this question, what if everything is controlled by the Lord? Means we also, all our actions, all our thoughts, everything is controlled. But it's not. Because when we talk about loving relationship, loving devotion service, love means free choice of love. Nobody can put a gun on our head and say, love me. It doesn't work like that. Then it is not love, it's just slavery. It's just like Krishna has produced lots of robots. That's not how the living entity works. Krishna is supremely independent and we are minutely independent. But the independence is there. He doesn't interfere with the minute independence of the living entity. Here the word Prabhu indicates that just as a child, having received a toy car from his father, pedals on the sidewalk, imitating the father who drives an actual car, the living entity pedals around the material universe in the innumerable material bodies selected for him by the Supreme Lord for an assortment of 8.4 million species. Thus, a living entity infatuated with the false ego of the material body creates a fearful situation in which he undergoes repeated birth and death, as described in the statement, Bhayam Dvitiya Abhiniveshitasya. So that's what happens. One body to another, with more desires to enjoy the material modes of nature. That's all it is. Srila Jiva Goswami has given another explanation for this verse. If the word Prabhu is taken to mean the Supreme Lord, the word Guna can be understood to mean good qualities, since Guna can refer to the material modes of nature or to admirable qualities, as in the verse Yasyasti Bhaktir Bhakti. This verse would then mean that the Lord, by his transcendental qualities, Guna, such as mercy, is able to relish the transcendental qualities, Guna, of his pure devotees. So that could be another meaning, but since the chapter is how to get free from the illusory potency of the Lord, and the question was, what is illusory potency? So Sridhar Swami and other acharyas have explained it differently. Atma pratyoditaha would then indicate that by surrendering unto the Lord, who is the reservoir of all good qualities, the pure devotees become similarly endowed with godly qualities. The words manyamana, idam srishtam atmana would indicate that the Lord accepts the body of his pure devotee to be on the same spiritual level as he himself, as indicated in the words Acharya Mamvijaniya. The Lord is attracted by the loving devotional service of his pure devotees and thus becomes entangled in the network of their loving relationship with him. For example, after the battle of Kurukshetra, when Krishna was leaving for his own city, Dwarka, the loving appeal of Maharaj Yudhishthira forced the Lord to remain for several more weeks in Hastinapur. Similarly, when the elderly gopis of Vrindavan clapped their hands, Krishna would dance like a puppet, keeping time to the rhythm. In relation to this subject matter, Srila Jiva Goswami has quoted the following verse. The pure devotee is always within the core of my heart, and I am always in the heart of my pure devotees. My devotees do not know anything but me, and I do not know anything but them. So this is if we describe the verse from Krishna saying that. Now, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, what he says, the word Prabhu may also be understood as follows. The word para indicates parakarshen or excessively, and bhu indicates bhavati, who takes birth. Means the Prabhu indicates repeatedly taking birth among the demigods, animals, human beings, and other forms of life. Confirming the statement by Srila Jiva Goswami, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur has quoted the following verses. That at the time of initiation, when a devotee fully surrenders unto the service of the Lord, Krishna accepts him to be as good as himself. Means then he accepts him as a spiritual personality. When the devotee's body is thus transformed into spiritual existence, the devotee in that transcendental body renders service to the lotus feet of the Lord. But if he is still on the bodily platform, then he is only trying to enjoy the material objects, material sense objects, which are only made of material modes of nature. There's nothing else. Text 6. Karmani karma bhi kurvan sannimitani dehbrit tattat karma phalam grehanam brahmatihi sukhetaram. Impelled by deep-rooted material desires, the embodied living entity engages his active sense organs in fruitive activities. He then experiences the results of his material actions by wandering throughout this world in so-called happiness and distress. This is how Maya captures a living entity. Argument may be given that if a living entity was subject to the results of his previous activities, there would be no scope for free will. Once having committed a sinful action, the living entity would be bound in an endless chain of suffering, being perpetually subject to previous reactions. According to this speculation, there cannot be a just and omniscient God, since a living entity is forced to commit sinful activities by the reactions of his previous activities, which were reactions to still previous activities. So the argument here is, if I commit sinful activities this lifetime, so next lifetime I have to suffer the reactions, but the desires are still there, so I'll be living in that kind of association of people who are sinful. So then where is the chance of getting out of this cycle? And if I'm right now, if I'm committing sinful activities, this is the reaction of my previous sinful activities, means I just perpetually go through this cycle of sinful activities, reactions again and again. And then the question is, how can God is merciful and how can God is just? How can we claim that? Further, it says, since even an ordinary gentleman will not unfairly punish an innocent person, how could there be a God witnessing the helpless suffering of the conditioned souls within this world? So the foolish argument can easily be refuted by a practical example. If I purchase a ticket for an airline flight, board the plane and commence the flight, once the plane has taken off, my decision to board the plane forces me to continue flying until the plane lands. But although I am forced to accept the reaction of this decision, on board the plane, I have many new decisions I can make. I may accept the food and drink from the stewardesses or reject it. I may read a magazine or newspaper. I may sleep, walk up and down the aisle, converse with the other passengers, and so on. In other words, although the general context, flying to a particular city, is forcibly imposed upon me as a reaction to my previous decision to board the plane, even within that situation, I'm constantly making new decisions and creating new reactions. For example, if I cause a disturbance on the airplane, I may be arrested when the plane lands. On the other hand, if I make friends with a businessman sitting next to me on the plane, such a contact may lead to a favorable business transaction in the future. So the independence is always there. We are not robots. Krishna does not make it. Now, except human beings, like animals, birds, plants, fishes, insects, they all are controlled by nature. They don't have free will. Means the soul is in such a situation, it cannot act on its own. Only in the human form of life, we've been given this free will. Soul is still the same. But in this human form, soul consciousness of the soul is more elevated than animals or birds. Of course, looking at some people, it doesn't even look like their consciousness is elevated. It looks more or less like just regular animals. But still, if they are in the human form of life, in a much better position. That's why this human form is so rare, so rare. Out of 8.4 million, only 400,000 forms are human forms, right? 8 million are other lower animals, lower species. So how careful we should be when we are in this human form of life. And then, like Krishna says, Bhagavad Gita, Manushyanam Sahasreshu Kashyati, out of thousands and thousands of human beings, one tries for perfection. And out of thousands and thousands of those, one comes to, hardly one knows me in truth. So rare. And cutting into devotional service, serving Krishna, that is even rarer. Similarly, although the living entity is forced to accept a particular body by the laws of karma, within the human form of life, there is always scope for free will and decision making. Therefore, the Supreme Personality of Godhead cannot be considered unjust for holding the living entity in human life responsible for his present activities, despite the living entities undergoing the reactions of his previous work. So, since the birth as the human form is so rare, it comes with lots of responsibilities. We cannot just act and live like animals, only worried about eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. According to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, the influence of Maya is so strong that even in a hellish condition, the proud, conditioned soul thinks that he is enjoying life. Even in a hellish condition, like we can see, literally see, those who are very, very poor and living in very degraded condition. Of course, we should have compassion for them, no doubt. But if they're living in like slums and if we see butchers, the whole life is like killing animals and taking, selling meat, cleaning up meat, and whole day they are dealing with blood and meat and other things. It's just hellish life. But they think they're enjoying. That is Maya. Itham karma gatir gachan bhav bhadra vahapaman abhuta sampalavat sarga pralayav ashnute avashaha. Thus, the conditioned living entity is forced to experience repeated birth and death, impelled by the reactions of his own activities. He helplessly wanders from one inauspicious situation to another, suffering from the moment of creation until the time of cosmic annihilation. Suffering. And how long from the moment of creation of the universe until the time of cosmic annihilation? According to Srila Madhvacharya, after hearing that the living entity is repeatedly subjected to birth and death within the material world, if one still considers that such a helpless entity equal to God in all respects, one will surely fall into the darkest regions of the universe from which it is difficult to rise. So we are nowhere close to God. We cannot be God if we are going through so much of suffering and inauspicious situations. Inauspicious situations mean lower forms of human life or lower forms of life. If you're born as a little insect, cockroach, ant, or something, what kind of consciousness we will have? But we still think I'm enjoying. But from absolute perspective, it's hellish life. Dhatu plav asanne vyaktam dravya gunatmakam anadi nidhanam kalo hi avyaktaya pakarshati. When the annihilation of the material elements is imminent, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, in his form of eternal time, withdraws the manifest cosmos, consisting of gross and subtle features, and the entire universe vanishes into non-manifestation. So this is what happens at the time of dissolution. In the third canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Lord Kapil Dev teaches that the material nature originally exists in an inert state of equilibrium called Pradhan. When Lord Vishnu casts his potent glance in the form of Kala or time, material interactions take place, culminating in the variegated creation of the material cosmos. In this verse, it is stated that at the end of universal life, the same Kal that originally incited the female nature into manifestation again withdraws the cosmos into its original state of inert non-manifestation. According to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the time potency itself, Kal, is then withdrawn and it merges into the Supreme Soul who manifests himself as the original cause of material nature. So everything merges back in the Supreme Soul or Mahavishnu. Such technical arrangements for creation and annihilation, birth and death do not exist in the eternal spiritual kingdom of God. In the spiritual sky, the variegated spiritual enjoyment of the Lord and his devotees is not hampered by the inferior cycles of birth, maintenance, and destruction found in the material world. So, all these problems are here in the material world, not in the spiritual. That place is Satchitananda, eternal, full of knowledge and full of bliss. Shatvarsha hi navrishtir bhavishyatul yulbash pulbana bhuvi tat kalo pachittosh shanarko lokanstrin pratapishyati. So what happens at the time of dissolution? As cosmic annihilation approaches, a terrible drought takes place on earth for 100 years. So for 100 years, there is no rain. For 100 years, the heat of the sun gradually increases and its blazing heat begins to torment the three worlds. And then what happens? Patalatal marabhya sankarshan mukhanalaha dhanur dhvashikho vishagvardhate vayu nerita. Beginning from Patal Loka, a fire grows emanating from the mouth of Lord Sankarshan. Its flames shooting upwards, driven by great winds, it scorches everything in all directions. So first, no rain for 100 years, and then fire comes from the mouth of Lord Sankarshan, who's carrying the universe on his head. And it just burns everything down in the universe. Samvartako megagano varshati sma shatam sama dhayabhir hasti hastabhir liyate salile virat. Hordes of clouds called Samvartak pour torrents of rain for 100 years. First no rain and burn down everything, and now full of rain. Flooding down in raindrops as long as the trunk of an elephant. The deadly rainfall submerges the entire universe in water. So Samvarta cloud, same Samvarta cloud Indra had called upon during the Govardhan Leela, Girdhari Leela. But Samvarta cloud, their job is only at the time of dissolution. Whole material creation will be annihilated. So it pours down torrents of rain for 100 years continuously. And the raindrops are as long as the trunk of an elephant. And the deadly rainfall submerges the entire universe in water. Can we even imagine what kind of scene that would be? Tato virajam utsrijya vairajah purusho nripa avyaktam vishate sukshmam nirindhan ivanala. Then Vairaj Brahma, the soul of the universal form, gives up his universal body, O king, and enters into the subtle, unmanifest nature, like a fire that has run out of fuel. According to Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, the word Vairaja in this verse indicates the totality of individual conditioned souls who originally take birth from Brahma and are amalgamated back into him at the time of annihilation. By the manifestation of the Virat Purusha, the universal form of the Lord, there is a temporary display of forms, qualities, and activities within the material creation. But the entire cosmic scene reverts to inert formlessness when the creation is withdrawn by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, the Lord's universal form cannot be accepted as an eternal form of the Lord. Universal form is temporary, imaginary resemblance of his personal form within the kingdom of Maya. Because this universal form was what? He says, mountains are like my bones, and the rivers are like the veins of the body. The trees are like hairs on the body. But so it's all material form, universal form. So it's not eternal form. This is just to come to the understanding of how great God is. In the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, as well as in the second canto, the universal form of the Lord is clearly explained to be an imaginary form offered to the neophyte for meditation on God. Those who are excessively materialistic are totally unable to understand that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is actually Satchidananda Vigraha, or the eternal form of bliss and knowledge, transcendental to the exhibition of material energy. Therefore, to encourage such gross materialists to become faithful theists, the Vedic literature instructs them to meditate upon the physical universe as gigantic body of the Supreme Lord. But it's not the real form, just imaginary. Srila Siddha Swami has quoted the following words as evidence that Lord Brahma is supposed to go back to Godhead at the time of annihilation. Obviously, not all Brahmajis go back, because there also is saying that every living entity who falls into the material world, first it takes the form of Brahmaji. So we were all Brahmaji of some universe at some time. And then further on down, we fell down. In this regard, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has pointed out that there are three categories within the status of Brahma, namely those of Karmi, Jnani, and a devotee. A Brahma who is the most exalted Karmi of the universe will have to come back to the material world. A living entity who has achieved the post of Brahma by being the greatest speculative philosopher within the universe may attain impersonal liberation. And a living entity who has been awarded the post of Brahma due to being a great devotee of the Supreme Personality of Godhead enters into the personal abode of the Lord. So every Brahma is different. It depends. Who's a devotee, he goes back. The Prabhupada said for our Brahma in this universe, he is a pure devotee. The way he has written Brahma Samhita, he is completely pure. So definitely he is going to go back. Brahma is the Lord of passion, and his creation and management of the entire universe are certainly Bahula Yasam, or strenuous endeavor in the most exalted sense. But all such passionate work, even that of Lord Brahma, is ultimately useless without surrender to the lotus feet of Krishna. So he does his service, but ultimately he has to surrender for perfection. Okay, so I guess we can stop here. See anybody has any questions or comments?
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Prabhuji, this is very strange to know that, like when you said, right, everybody was the living entity, were Brahma, sometime in the past. So this was never known to me.
Yep. Because when we fall, we are very pure. Consciousness is very pure. So we get the topmost personality of the universe, that position.
Mm.
And then we fall further. See, can you imagine the creation? I mean, every living entity was Brahma at some time of some universe. How big the creation is, how amazing.
That is what, Prabhuji, I mean, if we just think back that, I mean, this statement that sometime past, in the past, we were Brahma, so making that entire creation, it's absolutely nightmare.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prabhuji.
Okay, thank you, Prabhu. Chalo, we'll stop here. You all have a safe and wonderful day. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhuji.